Giuseppe Mercuri, or Uncle Joe as my family calls him, dreamed of migrating to Australia with my mother and my eldest brother and sister in the early 1950s. But Uncle Joe never made it to Australia. He was refused for political reasons and was forced to stay behind. Uncle Joe is a communist, a writer, and more recently, a painter.
At first, my family laughed at me because they thought it wasn't possible at my age, 55 years plus, to start painting. But then, as they saw the results, they started to believe in me. I liked painting even as a child. I remember when I used to take the goats and oxen to pasture with my brother. My brother used to draw on the prickly pears with his knife, and I would imitate him and try to do what he did. That was when I was 5 or 6 years old. I started late for a reason. That is, initially I had to find work in order to live. In my days it wasn't easy to find a job, so I migrated. I went to Milan, then from Milan I went to Switzerland. So my greatest problem was one of survival. Therefore I couldn't think about painting, poetry or writing. All that came later when I started to work as a teacher. I like all things that are close to nature, because nature is perfect. To me, the peasant is very important, because he hasn't as yet been corrupted, is in contact with the land, and therefore doesn't know society's tricks, because society lives on lies, deceit, and self-interest. The peasant isn't as yet contaminated by these things that man has invented for his own convenience. I was born on the land. My father and brothers were all peasants, so I have the peasant culture in me. I love the land, I love animals, because as a boy I had to take the goats to pasture, the pigs, etc. My life is more that of a peasant than anything else.
I'd heard about my Uncle Joe ever since I was a small child. He'd become notorious among my relatives for his strong beliefs. This is the story of his remarkable life and a very special journey. Giuseppe is having his first major exhibition outside of Italy. He's taking 26 of his paintings to Australia. Part of the preparation involved going to Naples to obtain government permission to allow his paintings to leave the country. In the past, many works of art were stolen or smuggled out of Italy, so nowadays a clearance is needed.
Lei è l'autore, complimenti. E una mostra? Sì. Una personale in Australia?
At the time, I was a communist, and a communist had no right to go to Australia. I was a communist because I saw a lot of injustice. I was a communist because I saw suffering. I was a communist because I saw hunger. I wasn't a communist just for the fun of it. I lived in a poor peasant world, abandoned to its own devices, so naturally I had to be a peasant. When I decided to change my lot in life and migrate to Australia, that great hope was also denied me. That's why I'm a pessimist, because my hopes have always been dashed and removed from me.
Cara Delia e Clara.
Dear Delia and Clara, Australia is a wonderful country. Its immense spaces, its endless horizons, and its warm nature, which turns winter into spring, give me the sensation of being in an extraterrestrial land. The first few days I asked myself whether it was inhabited by human beings or only by cars. You can travel hundreds of kilometers without coming across a single pedestrian. I'm pleased to have seen it for myself.
Diamo subito il benvenuto al professore. Professore, buonasera e grazie del suo intervento e della cortesia che ci fa nell'essere presente negli nostri studi. Che impressione ha avuto della comunità italiana di Perth e di Fremantle?
Dovrei dire un'impressione straordinaria, perché non pensavo mai che un calabrese che partisse da così lontano, venendo in questo mondo sconosciuto, potesse avere tanta accoglienza, tanto calore, tanto affetto.
your art? What sorts of things have you brought with you?
Ma i quadri che ho portato all'Australia naturalmente rappresentano il mio mondo, il mondo della miseria, della povera
the
gente.
world of
Quella
misery
gente
and
che ho
poverty,
visto soffrire
and the people who
nella
have
Calabria.
suffered in Calabria.
Io le vedo così come l'ho descritte, ecco, poveri, però felici, con una speranza ancora, che sperano anche fino alla morte.
Politica l'amaretto,
Vede specialità, Pasquale.
sì, bello pesce.
Specialità, chi sta cantando?
Penso che li visto.
Sì, mangio chilo. Quando vediamo meno 2 chili.
Eccolo qua.
2 chili ce ne vanno.
Sì.
Ma che bastano questi?
Davanti.
Non te ne sono 2. Claro.
Today is Uncle's last day as a primary school teacher before retiring at the age of 65. He's been teaching at the tiny mountain village of Pezzala, 20 minutes from his home in Carlogna Marina.
Insegno alla scuola da 30 anni.
I've been a teacher for 30 years,
Dal 1900.
since 1962-63, when I came back from Switzerland. That is, after I got married. School made me understand a lot of things. I saw this authentic and healthy seed which comes out, germinates, and continues to live. But when it comes in contact with society, it's no longer what nature created. Now that I'm finished, I'll be freer to devote time to my own pursuits. Whereas before I devoted all my time to the school, now I'll be able to pursue my favorite interests: painting, poetry, and writing.
Quanto gradiamo un angolo retto? 90 gradi. E se lo lascio invece in questo senso, che angolo è? Ottuso. È un angolo ottuso. Vediamo se Nicola mi sa dire che cos'è una circonferenza.
La circonferenza è una linea curva limitata da tutti i punti e distanza dal centro.
Uguale distanza dal centro. Ragazzi, sapete che è l'ultimo giorno della scuola, quindi come la vedete? Tu, Ruba, cosa senti e cosa provi l'ultimo giorno della scuola?
Che è la fine dell'anno scolastico, devo fare esami e che voi ve ne andate e a me mi dispiace molto. Anche che io l'anno prossimo credo che devo andare alle medie, però quando vengo a trovarvi voi non vi vedo.
Non ci sono, logico,
sì.
perché termina un ciclo per iniziare un altro.
Scappo!
I no longer resent you, my boy. Now I admire you. For a long time to come, I wish to see you enveloped in that carefree, exultant world of yours, forever surrounded by myriads of pretty, loving fairies. So don't be hasty. Play and jump around. This is your finest hour. Yes, stay like that, for before long, you too will follow in our footsteps. When you, like us, will play the game of life, the blows will come down hard. How lonely you will be, often walking with bleeding feet along the path spiked with thorns, which you will surely find along the way in the tough life awaiting you.
Prima di iniziare questa cerimonia in onore del maestro Mercuri, che dopo 30 anni di lodevole servizio lascia la scuola, porgo un saluto e un ringraziamento a tutti gli intervenuti. Al maestro Mercuri giunge il mio personale e affettuoso saluto e un ringraziamento sincero e commosso perché egli, in tutti gli anni in cui dedicò le sue migliori energie per i fanciulli a lui affidati, ha creduto sinceramente nel valore dell'opera educativa e il suo servizio è stato svolto con zelo e senso di umanità.
Innanzitutto voglio ringraziare il mio direttore, il nostro direttore, che gentilmente ha voluto pronunciare parole piacevoli. Volevo anche dire che andandomene ho voluto fare un omaggio alla scuola elementare con una mia tela.
E no, non sono voi e tutti gli altri. Avvicinate, accompagniamo Mill'anni,
Quando è arrivato Carmela, io lavoravo dentro la fattoria, però. Dopo lavoravo nella farma di mio fratello, come ci avevo già spiegato, a piantare i fagioli, i potati, era pronto.
La casa non l'avevate comprata ancora, quando è arrivata Carmela?
Sì, avevo comprato a casa quando è arrivato Carmela, tutto pronto. Mi è piaciuto tutto. È una casa piccola, vecchia, ma era bella dentro. Insomma, ho portato vostra sorella qua al 1952. Dopo state qua un bel po' di anni tutto tranquillo, dopo è cominciato a venire malata. Andavamo su e giù a Vittorio, da una parte all'altra.
Poi vi siete trasferiti?
E noi siamo trasferiti, dopo che l'è morta, ne siamo trasferiti in Perti. No? Ha fatto 15 anni di propria contentissima, va? Lei era sempre contenta. Abitavamo qui quando l'è morta, ma l'è morta in Perti, no?
Morta in Perti, ma abitavate qui?
Abitavamo qua.
Ho capito.
Ma lei era tranquilla perché c'aveva tanti altri parenti che venivano a trovarla, io andavo sempre a vederla.
Questa è la chiesa.
This is the church. An old man who died a centenarian when I was a boy told me he remembered when there was no bell tower and the bell was tied to an old oak tree. This church is very important for the area. There's an important feast day, that of the Madonna dell'Aiuto, and many people come here on that day. Here, for instance, is a historical monument, the oak, known as Ulicharu. It's very well known because in the old days, when there was no electricity, no phones, no nothing, the young people met under this tree to play and tell jokes and spend a pleasant evening together. This oak still exists today, but as you can see, it's rather decrepit.
Buonasera. Ringraziamo a Dio e tu. E ne quando partivo per la vita che mi pare che un lato e da presso.
Adesso per paura.
Sempre paura, che questo diciamo a Maria, come se quando io vedo mi pare che un club bandito e da presso io. Va bene,
Buonasera, come vanno?
vanno buoni, noi siamo buoni.
Although Giuseppe lives with his family, he still likes to visit his friends and relatives in his hometown of Uzzini nearby. He's remained close to his origins, and Uzzini holds many affectionate memories. During this visit, he calls in on his brother Nicola, who together with hundreds of other town folk migrated to Australia many years ago. Unable to join them, Giuseppe watched in frustration. And now, in a twist of fate, his brother and sister-in-law have returned and can't decide whether to live in Italy or Australia. Their home in Perth has stood empty for 2 years.
Come on. Oh, come on. La chiave della casa di sotto ce l'hai? Sì. Dove? Perché vorrei andare a visitare la casa. Sì, adesso vado a prendere la chiave. Va a prenderla.
Giuseppe and Nicola were 2 of 8 children, including my mother, who were all born in Ursini, and the old family home has played an important role in Giuseppe's work.
Il povero casa come è combinata. È ridotta male.
Non si abita più.
E anche queste altre stanze sono così.
È andata male, no?
La vecchia cucina.
Questa è la vecchia.
Ricordi?
Poi papà ha fatto quella di là.
Ricordi quando ci c'erano questi popolari? 8-10 persone. Oh.
Tutto abbandonato.
Questa è la stanza dove c'era una noi. Lì c'era il letto là, matrimoniale. Ti ricordi che c'era un telaio qua?
Un telaio?
E là dentro c'avevano aggiustato il letto. E una notte
siamo cascati
tutti per terra, rompere. Ricordare tutte queste cose. Anche questa è un po' malandata. Questa l'ho aggiustata io, ti ricordi? Per la sorella Teresa, ho messo il pavimento, ho interrogato i muri. Cioè, l'avevo messa in condizione di essere abitata. Adesso non c'è più nessuno.
Uncle lives in his new home with his 2 daughters, Delia and Clara, and his wife, Gracie. Aunt Gracie is a retired midwife. These days, she spends more time at home and is a passionate cook. Today, my Aunt Cecilia has offered to come and help make pasta. Mornings start early in the Mercuri family, usually around 6 o'clock. Unlike Australia, lunch is a main meal of the day in Italy. For many people, work finishes after midday. Others enjoy an afternoon nap before returning to work. Despite the modern way of life in this household, pasta making is done in the traditional peasant way. Food is made patiently and with respect. Like many Italian Australians, my mother used to also make pasta this way.
I wanted to go to Australia mainly to accompany my sister Carmela, who had got married and had to move to Australia because that's where her husband lived. She had to move there with her children, so we thought I'd accompany her. Anyway, I went with my sister and the children to Messina for the medical examination, and then we waited for the results. The medical went well, I was suitable. But when I sent my passport to the Australian embassy, they returned it without a visa, saying I wouldn't be able to get one. Well, subsequently, my brother-in-law Luigi, who was friendly with a senator in Australia, found out why I wasn't given a visa. So he wrote to me, telling me that I'd never be able to go to Australia to work, because I'd been accused of being a communist activist.
In Perth, Giuseppe stayed with my 80-year-old father, Luigi. Dad migrated here in 1926 and married my mother, Carmela, on one of his trips back to Ursini in the late 1940s. Giuseppe never saw his sister again. Mum died in 1967.
Questo è quando ho arrivato in Australia.
Io ero giovane.
Ho fatto abbastanza intorno a 16 anni.
16 anni.
Eccoci, ci siamo.
No, io l'ho fatto a Milano.
Sì.
Nel 1950, 51.
Questa è la tipa che hanno arroppato a Ursina, che
la
fece quelle fotografie.
Questo è il papà.
Dio, il papà vostro. Siete voi, il papà vostro, Carmelo, quei 2 bambini, vedete?
Sì.
Era Pietro e Cecilia. Pietro a mamma e Cecilia qua.
Pietro, sì.
Joe what he thinks of the prawns.
Se ti piacciono i gamberi, Bob vuole.
Ah,
Per fare.
Eat there in Italy too.
Yeah, you got the side. Are they as good as Italian?
Questi sono freschi, in Italia non li abbiamo freschi, sono congelati. Questi freschi.
You know, they are
He said these are fresh. In Italy, they're always frozen. When we immigrated, I was only a little bloke. Uncle escorted us all the way from Orsini to Reggio, and then from Reggio to Messina to get the ship. Neptunia, the name was the ship.
Oh, yeah.
And the night before the ship was due to sail, we stayed in Reggio. We had tea at a restaurant, and Uncle ordered a big plate of prawns. And, oh, Mum just about had a turn, and we wouldn't touch them because Mum said, oh, I'm not eating grasshoppers. What about it here?
Proni, se come te, ma proni, non volere nei proni, non mi danno ancora nei proni.
I had based all my plans for the future on going to Australia, so all my hopes were dashed. I was spiritually prepared. I had already made plans, so it was one of the harshest defeats I've experienced in my life, because I had to forgo something of great importance to me. So I packed my bags and left for Milan, where I spent 10 years of sacrifices, sleeping out in the open, dodging the police, because us people from the south weren't allowed to go to Milan to work, due to an old fascist law that prohibited us from doing so. So I spent 12 years of sacrifices between Switzerland and Milan, to no avail really, without ever earning a cent, whereas in Australia, because I was so young, I could have made something of my life. It was a great humiliation to me, because I felt I was equal to everyone else who'd applied. I didn't know that if you had an idea and professed that idea, you could be so discriminated against.
Politics has always played an important role in my family. It was only when I first went to Italy in 1977 that I realised where this avid pastime originated. For my uncle, serious political discussion is a daily ritual.
Allora, com'è andato il Consiglio Comunale? Io muoio, ma se ne vanno o no? O rimangono in carica?
Consiglio Comunale, Consiglio è sciolto. È dato la dimissione del sindaco e di 3 assessori.
Ma non si diceva che i comunisti appoggiavano?
Sì, hanno dato precedentemente l'appoggio esterno per fare una giunta minoritaria, ma poi al momento del voto del bilancio è caduto.
Ma come sempre i comunisti dentro l'appoggio solo per me bruciano mezza democrazia cristiana.
Convenienza politica, no?
Politicamente penso che siamo stati molto influenzati dalla sua idea. Infatti fin da piccolo abbiamo sempre, dall'idea comunista di mio padre, abbiamo sempre pensato allo stesso modo, anche se inizialmente lui era molto più autoritario, molto marxista, quello che invece ancora non noi eravamo più liberisti.
Cioè, il fatto di vivere una casa splendida, lui non è stato venuto fuori così, però non penso innanzitutto che sia molto splendida. Poi è venuto così, c'è mia madre, c'è l'influenza pure di mia madre, non bisogna non considerare l'influenza di mia madre, che ha una personalità.
Vabbè, comunque non è la casa che può determinare il modo di vita di una persona.
Sì.
Cioè, non può influenzare il modo di pensare di una persona, la bellezza o meno di una casa. Noi prima abitavamo in una casa molto diversa, vecchia e brutta, però eravamo sempre gli stessi.
Ma poi come possiamo dire, l'ideale comunista, cioè tu puoi vedere dalla storia politica all'estero, in tutti gli altri paesi europei, che l'ideale comunista non è più lo stesso, è cambiato, ed è stato necessario cambiare, perché quella schematizzazione nessuno la tollerava più, quindi uscire fuori dai canoni di quella schematizzazione esagerata, perché non è una casa che fa la persona.
The notion of Eurocommunism has never really been understood by most Australians. When Giuseppe wanted to migrate, the Menzies government of the time had conducted a Reds under the bed campaign in an attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. Communism was portrayed as a ruthless totalitarian system. This perception prevented Giuseppe from coming to Australia and contrasted greatly with his more humanitarian version of communism, which reflected a concern for the plight of his fellow Calabrians.
On the church steps and along all the footpaths and at the town's main intersections from dawn to dusk, All that could be heard were the pitiful wails of all those asking passers-by for something. Behind the walls of the olive mills at harvest time, of the mills in all the seasons of the year, around the threshing floors during the threshing of the wheat, you could see scores of them, awaiting a drop of oil, a handful of cereals, corn, or anything else. They dragged around greasy knapsacks, mouldy terracotta bowls, and old sacks made out of broom to collect those minute pieces of bread that the more charitable servants managed to take from the dogs guarding the entrances to the rich people's homes.
My book, The Republic of Caulonia, was born after the insurrections in Caulonia in 1945. It was a very interesting event for Caulonia, because Caulonia had always been a feudal town subject to the landowners, and the majority of its inhabitants had always been very weak and had to endure the treatment of the rich and the powerful of the time. And during the fascist era, Caulonia was still depressed, mistreated, and forced to endure exploitation. So, in 1945, after the fall of fascism, the people rose up against fascism and the bosses. So we declared a republic. I wanted to describe it, to write everything that happened in that period. They were difficult and important times for the South, for the liberation of the South. Because although creating the Republic of Caulonia is meaningless, it is essentially a political gesture to demonstrate that the South mustn't be downtrodden, but liberated, and have a human face rather than an inhuman one, which is often what we're portrayed as.
The Republic of Caulonia is one of 8 books Giuseppe has had published. These include 4 books of poetry and 4 of fiction. Like his paintings, his written works live and breathe the air of Calabria and represent a lifetime of creative achievements.
I come here to write because I'm alone and it's quiet. No one disturbs me. You need concentration to be able to write. No distractions, nothing else to think about. I mainly write for myself, to satisfy my soul, to express everything I feel, everything I've experienced. Naturally, it pleases me if someone else reads it too and can gain some advantage from it. So, instead of living through what I've lived, because of my experiences, they'll find it's all there and won't need to live the same life of suffering that I did.
Then the village appeared before him, not quite awake yet, but softened only by the rays of the sun, shining down on the blackened roofs of the old homesteads and on the town's muddy, narrow streets. There couldn't be a warm welcome. A few houses scattered in among trees dotted the countryside, a small school set up in an abandoned stable, several run-down dwellings, a few sheds, and a fountain noisily gushing in the centre of the little square. Now and then, some bony old woman appeared, stooping under the weight of years, dressed in black and barefoot. The men had an earnest and hardened look. Some, coming out of the stable with cattle, appeared with bearded faces, patched-up clothes, hair sticking out of the moth-eaten rim of their hats, faces wrinkled by suffering, sunken eyes, fierce looks, and gruff voices.
Unfortunately, we can't go back, and none of us want to return to those conditions because it was a life of hardship and sacrifice. But I must admit that although it was a hard life, it was a happy and peaceful one, because there wasn't the conflict that exists today with progress and consumerism, in which you don't even have the time to catch your breath because you're constantly obsessed with work and commitments. In those days, we'd eat broad beans, drink a glass of wine and go to bed. We'd go barefoot. We didn't have any fancy clothes, but we were happy because we didn't have any great needs. As needs increase, our lives become unhappy.
Quello lì, tutto pulito così io lavoravo, proprio. E dopo più giù abbiamo passato, erano tre sorelle che erano i miei padroni. E lì andavo a mangiare vacche, dopo mi mandavano a pulire a legname, tirare a legname secca via di quelle belle piante cariche, no? Tirare via la legname secca per non prenderle il fuoco.
Non bruciare.
Ma qui veniva, di basso il sonno veniva con la bricichetta, perfino qua.
My brother-in-law tells me he came here at the age of 16 and ended up in this forest. He says he arrived at night and slept under a tent. When he woke up the next morning, all he saw was a canopy of trees. I must say that having to lead the life he had to lead and make all the immense sacrifices that he and so many others who arrived at the time had to make would have been very difficult. But things had changed by the time I was supposed to come. I wouldn't have had to go into the forest like he and so many other fellow Calabrians had to, so my life would have been much easier than his. I'm convinced that if I were 30, I wouldn't hesitate for 1 minute. If I had the opportunity, I'd come to live in Australia right away. I like Australia. It's a new country. It's a country that assists those who want to make something of their lives. I like it very much, although there are some things that are in contrast with European culture. For instance, the great distances, which don't allow people to get close. So this is the negative aspect, because this rapport doesn't exist. As for the rest, I like Australia, both for its climate, its environment and layout.
Professor Mercurio, signore. C'è, Ettore c'è.
Buongiorno. Ettore vi aspettava, vi aspetta. E sotto che mettono l'acqua la casa sua nuova, qua vicino. Sentite, telefono.
Grazie.
Vedete che è aperto di là, spingete ed entrate.
Come dormio.
Oh,
Che buono.
molto bene, tu.
Oh, sì, ti vedo bene. Ti vedo bene.
Professore, Ettore non ha capito che la
Ciao, ti vedo benissimo.
Cioè, con Ettore Scoleri ci siamo conosciuti molti anni fa. Quando...
Ettore Scoleri and I met many years ago when my wife was assigned as a midwife to Gerace. So I stayed there 2 years and we became great friends. Through our conversations, I noticed there was an affinity in the way we saw things. So much so that when I started painting, the same characters that appear in his sculptures appear in my paintings. It's a single language, my artistic language and his.
Like this painting of my grandmother, Giuseppe's work not only shares this theme of suffering, they're also joyous and vibrant. Giuseppe uses the colours of nature, of the land and of Calabria itself.
I tried to choose the most interesting subjects, the ones that illustrate and attempt to solve a problem, a human problem above all. In fact, it's very obvious that all my canvases have a human theme to them. I think my subjects have their eyes closed for 2 reasons. The first is to dream, to be able to go on dreaming, and the second is to be able to bear the suffering that torments them. Those who suffer like to close their eyes. just as those who dream like to close their eyes to hope, because when faced with the reality of life, all they can do is dream and hope.
Questo era il posto dove dimorava il miglio e lui era molto contento, non voleva andare neanche nella casa perché era più pulito qua per lui, più comodo.
Era più a suo
E
agio.
lui voleva lavorare, mica fare della casalinga in casa, pulire le cose. Lui voleva andare in campagna a lavorare.
Emilio was a close friend of Giuseppe's, who after an unsuccessful attempt to settle in Uruguay, returned to Italy. An orchardist by trade, he decided to start afresh in Australia and help plant this vineyard. During 7 years of living alone, Emilio never lost heart and saved money for his family to join him.
Allora quelle rocce là, tutte Emilio l'ha tolto veramente.
Ma mica tutti, il bulldozer,
Sì,
ma lui a maneggiare quelle cose là. Lui era molto forte. Il povero Emilio amava questo posto così tanto, ha lavorato così duro, aspettava per la moglie e la famiglia di venire,
certo.
Loro erano quasi pronto credo da venire e lui sfortunatamente si è ucciso
È morto
in questo
così.
infortunio sulla strada.
Sì.
L'ultimo giorno della vendemmia lui andava per prendere la mostra del vino con l'apparecchio e ha avuto un incidente stradale, è stato ucciso subito.
You who've always reigned undisturbed and soothed the tired souls of mortals. Although hated by those who dream and hope, once invoked, you descend among us as master. A welcome sight to the vanquished and wounded as they close their eyes and find their rest. You remove from us all cares as you slowly place your sweet hand upon us mortals.
100 anni fa non c'era questo cimitero.
This cemetery wasn't here 100 years ago. The dead were buried under the floor of the church. So it's a very young cemetery. It's barely 100 years old. The town of Ursini is also very young. It's about 150 years old. It's a town that was born from the shepherds who came down from the mountains to the marina because of the winter snow. Then they stopped here and started to build the first houses, and that's how the town was born.
Mo qua sono tutti qua. È forte. E che dati che avevano pure, andava pure papà, mamma, e Giuseppe ne esce, e Consiglia ne esce.
Questo si fece all'Australia, sta fotografia. Quando era all'Australia. Poi, quando, una volta disse, quando moravo, le su la tomba.
Ed erano vicini in casa, con papà mio, e vicini stanno qua.
Mi interessa la cultura perché attraverso la conoscenza.
I'm interested in culture because through a knowledge of the ancient history of the various peoples who inhabited our region and our land, we can appreciate the value of our land.
Diversamente noi non possiamo mai conoscere.
Otherwise, we'll never know the origins, the history and the suffering of the Calabrian people, and all the changes that took place in the times of our fathers and of our fellow citizens. We have some great treasures in the south. Every town has very important historic monuments which shouldn't be allowed to die. What's happened to this castle? You can see what's happened. such an immense value, so important to everyone, to the history of the town, has been so neglected that it no longer has any value. It's dead. To think that instead of restoring it, they've housed goats inside it.
It was the 21st of October, one of those glorious mornings that down there in Calabria, especially on the majestic coast of the Ionian Sea, often mingles the mystical silence of autumn with a pleasant breeze of a fragrant early spring. All around, on the mountains, along the boisterous valleys, on the expanse of the green plain, in and out of the villages, there was a festive air. In the old days, when there were no means of communication, the mountain people had to walk many kilometers to reach the village. And already from dawn, you could see long queues of people come singing down the slopes, the women carrying large wicker baskets on their heads, and the men carefully holding by their tails the donkeys laden with heavy loads, a few children riding on their backs, and one or two babies in the side pouches.
Ciao zio! Ciao. Siamo arrivati, nonna, siamo arrivati.
Scendete, venite.
Accomodatevi.
Accomodate. Scendete.
Siamo arrivati, nonna.
Venite a prendere un caffè.
È andata bene il viaggio?
Sì, tutto bene. Sì,
Come va?
Di farti all'Australia.
Prego.
A casa stanno bene?
Sì, bene. Loro partiti, zio.
Sì, domani sera voglio fare questo vestito in Australia.
C'era stata proposta, abbiamo visto
La Sicilia sembrava che faceva le fotografie stamattina, perché io ero bella rilassata, tranquilla, a suo agio, perché lei è molto abituata a ricevere, a farsi fare delle fotografie, infatti ci parlava che tante volte le hanno fatte le fotografie, le ha viste,
Sì,
è molto fotogenica.
Ma vai su per la moto? Ma che pensi? Io non veniva, ma cosa mi pagavo? Veramente, dove sei pieno?
Ma lei scusa, mica era la prima volta che andavo sulla moto.
Se non vedi a Sicilia vai tu sulla moto, o no?
Ma tu che c'entravi sulla moto? Non è la stessa cosa, scusa.
Come?
Non c'è lo stesso spirito.
No, per me dici, se non vedi a Sicilia, sulla moto io devo dire, e ora no, che ce l'ho la testa.
Io porto queste pitture in Australia forse per due motivi.
I'm taking these paintings to Australia for two reasons. Firstly, to see the reaction to them overseas, that is, to my paintings and my style of painting. And secondly, also to make known what I do in Italy, which isn't known. Perhaps those of Italian origin in Australia will accept them, since many come from peasant backgrounds. And years ago, they used to live in my hometown Ursini, where there was a lot of poverty and suffering. So, when they see my paintings, they'll remember those years, maybe with nostalgia, but also with sadness, because suffering is never forgotten.
Mi raccomando, il telefono ogni tanto,
Ciao.
Ci vediamo prima di settembre.
A settembre
A
arriverò.
settembre?
Ciao.
Forse meglio prima.
My uncle and his family had never been apart before. It was the first time he'd travelled overseas. But for Giuseppe, the 24-hour flight represented only a brief moment in a lifetime of waiting.
Questo è Yolinda. Dominique. James sapete. Louis. E Josephine.
Signora Rosa lo sa, è un po' tanto. A me non mi conosce che non è.
Io non mi conosco a me.
Dominique.
Domenico no, Domenico no, non lo ricordo. Non lo posso ricordare Domenico. Mattia sì.
Come
è?
Buon.
Penso che sia Giuseppe Mercurio. Ah, molto.
Che la cugina, Madonna. Come si? Come si?
Buono. Sono un po' invecchiato. Mercurio, piacere.
Piacere di conoscerti. Benvenuto a Fremantle.
Grazie.
Welcome
Ringrazio
to Fremantle.
molto. Grazie, io ringrazio molto per avermi accolto, aver fatto quello che state facendo per me.
Right, have a big smile. Giuseppe?
Giuseppe's reception in Fremantle was a significant one. For the first time, he'd felt welcomed and understood. Fremantle had been the first port of call for many migrants coming to Australia, and a lot stayed there. Others, including my father, had settled in the southwest countryside in search of work. About 25% of Fremantle's population is of Italian origin. Most arrived either before or just after World War II. Appropriately, Giuseppe's exhibition was held at the local town hall.
Signora, io proporrei, a posto di questo, mettere quelle due dietro, che sono dall'altra parte. Fa più impressione quando entrano, no? Quando meglio. Ieri sera ci fu la tanto.
Last night was the opening night of the long-awaited exhibition of the Mercuri paintings. A grand affair in the true sense of the word. For the first time, I saw sincere and interested people who were all intent on observing my strange canvases. Strange, but interesting, was their comment. The exhibition was packed, so much so that people had trouble moving around. In the course of that wonderful evening, I was forced to accept some 20 invitations from Italians I didn't even know, apart from our own townfolk. I witnessed great human warmth and a great deal of interest in the colors of a Calabrian painter.
I would now invite Giuseppe to please come forward and address us with some words.
Mi dispiace non poter parlare in modo di essere capito da voi perché non conosco l'inglese. Io avrei voluto essere molto tempo prima in Australia e poter dare un contributo con le mie opere, con il mio lavoro, con tutto ciò che mi era possibile dare a questa grande nazione, l'Australia, che per me è bellissima, e sono rimasto sorpreso e ammirato. Quella terra che ha dato vita, lavoro e pace a tanti miei concittadini. Sono felice e sono commosso. Scusatemi. Un cucchiaio basta.
Yeah, just one. Uno.
Uno. Io ne metto due per me.
Grazie.
Adesso vedrete com'è il caffè italiano.
Mettete loro che mi tremano.
Lo volete metterlo là?
Là.
Ecco qua.
Salute.
Che ne dite? Come va?
Più o meno adesso, ci avete messo il zucchero.
Hai visto che differenza che c'è tra il caffè italiano e quello australiano?
L'australiano è più bello, no?
Voi bevete acqua, a me piace bere il caffè. Penso che al Parlamento mi hanno invitato per il fatto che...
I think I was invited to Parliament House because I was once denied a visa and they now wanted to express their friendship.
Di amicizia,
They wanted to demonstrate that Australian politicians are no longer what they once were and that they're different today.
Uncle honoured his visit to Parliament with the donation of one of his paintings, Il Dormiglione, or The Late Riser. No one seemed to notice the irony of his choice.
It's something of great significance, not only for me, for my family and my town, but for all those Calabrians who live in Australia. They feel more appreciated. For a Calabrian to come here and receive this respect and this honour is something very beautiful. It's something important.
For Uncle Joe, his trip to Australia had been a journey of hope, a hope which had taken 40 years to realise. During his 3-month stay, he saw nearly all his old friends, his exhibition was a success, and he eventually sold 19 of his 26 paintings. He was satisfied to be leaving a little of himself behind. Giuseppe intends writing a book about his experiences called From Carlonia to Fremantle. I wondered whether his visit to Australia had mellowed the regrets and bitter memories of the past. So I asked him if he was pleased to be going back home, and he replied, "Does a bird like to return to its nest?" Giuseppe returned to Italy on the 16th of September 1990.
Vecchia casetta mia, orfana.
My little house of old, you orphan born. You move me to endless tears every time that charmed splendor of yours rekindles in my soul yesterday's hopes. Happiest of all you are if you remember the cradle of the lovely, boundless dreams we enjoyed as carefree and lazy children, aimlessly by the sea. When still a shack, you were so filled with light. Your smoky, blackened walls glowed with a pious, mystical peace. Peace of days gone by. Blissful peace.